I know we have a good block of time this morning, but I'm actually hoping that we don't go through the full amount of time. I think I can cover the key concepts in less, if anyone is, unless someone is just dying to have an extra 15 minutes. But tell me at any time you can send questions. I'm happy to pause or to answer something if it's not clear right away. But I also like to, I try to keep the contents, the subject as focused as I can so that the concepts are easy to digest. And if there's any other amount of detail, you can always feel free to follow up either with questions here, or you can connect with me on LinkedIn, or just send me an email, etc. And we can talk more about any of the topics here. And of course, if I see that there's strong interest, then I would be happy to volunteer for a similar session where we go deeper into some of those themes, maybe even into some of the nuts and bolts, instead of the stopping at the solution architecture level like we will here today. So as Jennifer pointed out, the theme here is information architecture, theory and practice. And my name is David Lewis Hollembaek. I am an architect at Microsoft Consulting. I'm a CITA specialist. I went with an emphasis on information architecture there. I've spent many years in productivity solutions, helping people to build productivity stories with an emphasis on bringing the right information together. And so when Jen points out that I'm a subject matter expert in search, that's also a designation that comes from Microsoft Consulting. So within our consulting group, I'm I'm seen as a global expert in the search space. So although most of the problems that I'm trying to solve are related to information architecture, it's not just nuts and bolts of search. So that said, today we'll quickly go through this intro, a little bit about me, the problems that we tend to see in information architecture, concepts that are important to IA as well. I'll try to use IA instead of information architecture going forward so that it's a little less of a mouthful. And of course, the solutions that we come to. Would anybody online now say that they are practicing in this area already, or focusing on these topics, or that they have information problems in general? You can send notes to the chat window if you're no comments. Let's see if is there a. All right. So as mentioned before, Microsoft Consulting, as Jen has pointed out, I'm living in Germany. I came to Microsoft from industries. I was in commercial banking and telecommunications before joining the side of the software vendor. So when I'm looking at problems and solutions, I very much take this perspective of the consumer, because not just a end products consumer myself, but I've been on the purchasing side of the corporate arrangements in the past, and I know what a typical business is expecting to get when someone shows up with a bunch of answers or offerings. And I'm very tuned into what that consumer is expecting to see, and what kind of results they might want to get. And this has developed my view of the industry quite a bit. So you might see a lot of this emphasis on the end user and what the person is getting in my work. And last but definitely not least, I am a father, of course, as well, which also lends to my willingness to speak slowly and to make sure the concepts are understood. So this is a little bit about me. Also, some of these little badges here, you see the PSPO. For anyone that's not familiar, this is a Professional Scrum Product Owner and Professional Scrum Master. I know that a lot of people know the PSM and the Scrum.org group, but I also I dive deep on this side where we build the solution and we build the story. And I think this is a very overlooked part of the agile space, the product ownership space. And so if anyone is trying to design solutions and is interacting with the end consumer, I highly recommend that you look in this direction as well, because you might learn a lot about what a business owner is expecting, and you might learn a lot about how to present concepts so that they fit better for everyone. So if you're into Scrum or into Agile, then don't neglect this corner of your Scrum team. So, information. It's our problem. I know we don't usually think about it as a problem, but it is very much frequently overwhelming us. We have so much new stuff that we're creating all the time. I won't bore you with statistics, but I know that the last time I was checking, we saw these data that said things like, terabytes of new data are being created every month, and we're spinning up more and more volume, more and more packages, more and more containers. That is, that we used to just make documents, for example, and now we're making pictures and videos on our mobile phones, and we're pulling in geolocation data and all kinds of analytics and point-in-time data that's being used for IoT solutions. All of this information is expanding rapidly in all directions, and it makes some big problems for us that information architecture aims to solve. So these are my favorite summaries for what is the problem of information architecture. Too much, too little, or not the right. These are paraphrases, by the way. They're not exact quotes. Too much, too little, or not the right. This was a description that came from How to Make Sense of Any Mess, Information Architecture for Everybody, from Abby Covert. And information overload and contextual proliferation. This is my favorite. And this comes from the proverbial polar bear book, Information Architecture for the Web and Beyond. So when I'm trying to describe the problems of organizations to my clients, I usually use the Covert example. And if I reference her later, I will just say Covert. And if I reference the Information Architecture for the Web and Beyond, I'll refer to this as the polar bear book. But Covert's description is the one that I'm most commonly using to describe my work to someone that's not familiar with information architecture. But I really like the second description, especially the phrase contextual proliferation, because I think this is a very overlooked problem as well. We tend to focus on the volume of information and not so much on the context that it's being created or consumed in. And this is this is what leads to a lot of confusion about what's the right information at any given time. So you'll hear me. We'll talk a little bit more about this as we go forward here. So the key tenets, and again, these are ones that are slightly borrowed from the polar bear book, who refers to this as data, users, and context. I don't really like to refer to our end consumers as users when they're just people trying to get things done. So throughout this presentation, I will refer to our user base as people. But be aware that if you are reading in the industry, if you're reading the polar bear book, if you're reading How to Make Sense of Any Mess, or Understanding Context, or any of these key books in the IA space, they will usually refer to consumers or people as users, and I'll refer to them here as people. So one other thing that I'll include that is not always a part of the standard view is audiences, and that's obviously some subsets of your people. But it's often overlooked, again, that if we look at a simple model and we say all people are the end consumers, but we're breaking them up into a lot of other audiences, into a lot of other groups, and I think it's important to keep this in mind from the moment that you first start envisioning how these layers or how these components interact. If we think about the audience at the beginning, that our user is one of many people, or that these people are grouped together by some common features, then they're an audience. And if I don't think about it as one person but as an audience, I feel that it's a lot easier to build a solution towards that audience. So this is the trinity of information architecture here. the context, the people, and information. And in the classic Venn diagram way, we can see that there's only a tiny bit of overlap in the contexts and the people and our information. And a lot of our challenge is trying to bring these items closer together so that it's easy to match up people and information through their various contexts. It's pretty easy to think about what kind of things might fit into here in order to put a better shape on this. I tend to think about context as being places or situations, things like in the office or purchasing or on a mobile device or in the research department or English speaking. That these are all things that describe some bit of information that isn't really the person and it isn't really the information. It's something that changes the way you perceive the information or the people. People, on the other hand, when I'm referring to people here, I'm usually thinking of roles within an organization, like an analyst or an executive, a student, a business partner. These are people that maybe have different needs and different views, and as we'll see, of course, they always have varying contexts that impact how they see our information. So when we're looking at information inside of an enterprise, I tend to see that we break up information as being like document management systems, that we have something that's storing a lot of data. We have catalogs, we have master data, we have metadata systems, all core sources of information that was processed with some kind of context or some kind of view in mind at the beginning. I say in the beginning because almost every business system that's been implemented represented some kind of business context. That is, if a customer tells me that they need to bring some data into a modern user experience to a specific people, that is, and the data is locked up, so to say, in some kind of platform. And when I am looking at this platform, it was designed to serve a very specific business need already. There used to be a person that came in, and from 9 to 5, this person opened up this system and looked at record A and then added some data from another system or called a customer or did something else, put some data into the system and then closed it. And in the new model, someone else needs to see some of this information, or they're expanding the business in another direction and they need to reach out and get some of this, but they're applying a new context on top of the old context, and this starts to make the context story and the information story a little less clear. And this brings me to what I think is the big problem, not the simplified version. No document fully and accurately represents the intended meaning of the author. No label or definition totally captures the meaning of a document, and no two readers experience or understand a particular document or definition or label in quite the same way. It's a little wordy, but I feel that this really captures something, a message that I've been trying to deliver to customers for many years, and that's that the context from creation of data very rarely matches the context of consumption unless you were in a specific role. That is, if you created that record in that specific system and you only consume it there, then there's never any information confusion. There's no overload. There's no confusion about how that's supposed to be worked with. But when I try to resurface it somewhere else, anywhere else, then there's no longer any guarantee that your user or the person that's consuming this is actually going to be seeing the data in the same way. It may have a totally different meaning to this other person. So what does that mean for our very simple model here of information, context, and people? Probably that it should look more like this. And I think maybe some people in the audience, anyone that's maybe working in this field today would identify with that we share the simple type of model that shows how we're bringing content and people together to make good experiences. But the reality of it is that things are kind of a mess. And if we take it a little further even and say that as I bring people through some context for that information, I can get them there usually with technical tools very, very quickly. But frequently, once you get there, you discover that there's all kinds of odd-shaped holes in that information, things that you didn't really realize were necessary. Again, because the context of the consumer is different from the context of the creator. So it's inevitable to an extent that there would be some gaps in the data. And this is where we start to look at technical solutions to resolve this kind of problem, where we say, what if I want to fill in some of those shapes, or do my people, my end consumers, do they need to see all of those pieces the way that we're expecting? Can I reshape them? Can I reshape the information, or do I have to augment it and build on it? And these are some key but simple to answer usually questions. You know, a user story will tell you whether or not the user needed to see the thing that's inside of this Pac-Man cutout here when they were working with the solution. But that said, let's look at a quick example of how we might break up an audience, or how people experience a search environment today. So we'll look here at our student. He's working from a tablet at a university in Portugal. He does a quick search online for Munich, and he gets immediately some key information. You know, he sees something about universities in Munich. He gets results in Portuguese, and he sees some key points of interest, starting with the Oktoberfest, a popular activity for students from all countries. Now, when our student here is landing on a search page, we tend not to think about it, but we actually knew a lot about the student before he even started to do anything. We know that he's connected to the internet from a location inside of Portugal. We might even know that he's inside of a university. We might know that he's on a tablet, and the tablet might be something that's only issued to students. You know, maybe it's a special issue of one thing or another. Maybe he's in a portal page that was built by his school, and the school therefore is able to identify him and knows exactly what kind of data or what kind of experience they might want to put together for a student looking for something. So that said, we can kind of break it down into something really simple. Students with Sergio's context are looking for this kind of data. And the desired, however, we have one set of data, but if we change the context a little, or if we change the person, then suddenly we have a very different view, and we no longer, we no longer have to worry, or we don't have to worry so much about the view of the Oktoberfest, and maybe a little more about something else, like research that's being conducted at that institution. You know, if I know that the person that's connecting is coming from a faculty building, then maybe I will want to show ongoing research projects and less about the Oktoberfest. So one benefit when we're working on public web solutions is that we don't really have to worry about security. And this is something that I don't plan on getting into in any amount of detail, but we will talk, when we talk about people, I tend to bring in the topic of identity very often. And here I'll point out that we're getting identities from directory systems, for example, because usually I'm working inside the firewall, and usually the end business is actually having a pretty good idea of what a person is trying to accomplish, what kind of role they have, and what kind of work they're supposed to be doing. If you're looking at a public solution, you don't have to worry so much about security, but you also tend to take all of your context data from these kinds of third-party stretches, like I just described. That are you looking from a university campus? Are you in a certain country? Is it a certain time of day? And these are not, they may provide solid data, but they're not precise. You don't necessarily know exactly who the searcher is, or the person that's trying to locate some information. So that said, if I focus more on the enterprise side, where I tend to see people that have problems that need to be solved, and they can put a monetary price tag on them. But also that these inside the firewall, we have this special advantage, and that's that we usually know exactly who the user is, and we might even know exactly what they're supposed to be doing when they're using this kind of system, or when we're trying to pull information together for them. So let's think about some of our circles in terms of what they might look like inside of a inside of the enterprise. I tend to think about our triad here as being kind of a bridge, where context is context is this thing that's connecting our people and our information. So when I'm working with people, I'm usually working with things like Azure Active Directory, a directory service that tells me or authenticates people so that when someone is connecting to a system, I have some precise way of identifying them. And not just to authorize them, for example, but to know about them, to build a profile. The information side for me, as was mentioned previously, I'm a Microsoft employee. I can assure you most of the time I'm working with Office Stack and collaboration tools like those that come from SharePoint and Office 365. So that said, I would frequently try to push our context together with our content by using things like creating detailed user profiles. Anybody that's been working with SharePoint in the past is probably at least modestly familiar with user profiles. The concept is pretty simple. You could think of a LinkedIn profile, incidentally. These user profiles usually contain some key data, the user's name, where the user is located, and what kind of skills they may have, etc. Now, frequently I find that there's very little data in these systems, but there is always an opportunity to dig up more. There are usually many, many systems. Some of them are master data systems, for example. Some of them might be other HR systems. And these systems will have all kinds of data in them that you might be able to synchronize into the user profile service inside of SharePoint. And this gives me a lot of context about the people that are using the service. It doesn't do anything for my information. It only gives me context around people. But this allows me to align contents or information that I'm seeking to very specific things about my people. It gives me a big glimpse of context. There may be a lot of things that I would like to know about an end user that I can't get from any other system, or I can't put into a user profile. But it gives me a huge head start in terms of knowing my user. And likewise, if I'm working with a public-facing service, then I probably don't have this kind of option. I probably don't have the option to build a massive profile on top of any given user, because I just don't have all of this data. So let's think about let's try to put a little more shape on this. And we'll say here, we'll say that we have some architectural building blocks. We have these key concepts that we might be working with in a productivity solution, like team collaboration tools, metadata management, identities, audiences, authoring, web content management. These are all things that I see putting together on a regular basis to produce some kind of content solution. And if I want to start building a stack, a solution model to go with this, then it usually looks a little more like this, where I have my user experiences at the top, people, as I like to call them, even though the official terminology is user experience. But I'll have these, these same building blocks, but I will be using core tools in order to fill in those gaps. So you could say that all of these elements are my solution building blocks if you're into TOGAF, for example. So I have my components like SharePoint that I'm using to fill in lots of collaboration gaps. I have my creation tools like Office. This could be any number of other tools. I'm also a fan of Notepad++. And I am building experiences using some very common technologies, any given web server, Azure Web Services, and usually building a lot of front-end logic with HTML5 or JavaScript. So I can take these very core components and build up a solution architecture that provides me with my content storage, and a number of other services that I might want to use in order to produce a little more context, like my identity management, metadata management, and of course search, that we'll see in a few minutes here how we start to use this as some glue that helps to put things together. So as we mentioned before, there's no two no two readers are looking at a certain document or a certain label in the same way. This is one of the reasons that the search is so prominent here in connecting user experience and content, because we have this opportunity to try to shape a little bit of the experience. If we think about it again in a solution architecture style, we have this view. I have my information, I have my experiences, I have identities. Maybe my information is coming from any number of locations. These are all platforms I work with regularly. And when I'm looking at the search system, what I'm usually looking at it for is to do something very, very specific. I want to build experiences for my people, and I need to fill in context. And this is why I put search with a question mark here and context with a question mark, because I know that we're not used to thinking about search as a context generator or even as the bridge, but I feel like what I observe is that it fits very nicely here in terms of helping me to bring the context, bringing context together with my, or to add more context to my content than was there before. I might have profile data that I can leverage in order to add more context to a user, but if I want to add more context to data, then I have to look somewhere in between. I can either say that I'm going to start forcing more metadata into my content, which is usually very unpopular, or rather popular with IT teams and unpopular with end consumers. People don't like being told that they have to do something that's not fun. So I tend to see that people organizing information inside of firms will frequently tell me, I need to have a really strong metadata strategy. I need to be able to put a lot of content into a system, and I need to make sure that all of my users embed all kinds of taxonomy data into a record that they put into a system. But end users hate doing this. And I've worked on many projects where we say that it's mandatory to assign a functional area, for example, to a document that goes into a document management system. And within months of this going live, you start to see meaningful usage reports, for example. And these usage reports will tell us things like 99% of the projects were launched from Albania, which is not the case. But this is the first option on the list, and because it's mandatory to select the location, you tend to just, or people tend to just pick the first item that gets them to the next screen, because they don't really want to bother with this. Now, if we're saying that it's mandatory to put the location into the document or the source location, but it doesn't have any bearing on a business process, then it was probably a waste of effort to begin with. But that's another topic. But what we tend to see, though, is that forcing people to use metadata tends to not work very well. They're not very happy with the results usually. And so we look for other ways to stuff some context in the middle. So here, this slide is on loan to me from my colleagues at Search Technologies. They make a platform for content ingestion. They do a lot of consulting around the search space as well. But here I'm using this as an example of how we might try to work with information and try to create a little more context. I work with a lot of partner toolkits. I've done work with customers that are using tools from BA Insight and Ration here in Germany, but I've done a lot with Search Technologies, and as a result I already have a lot of comfort in working with some of their slides here. So we'll say that we're gathering information from these various content sources, and we might even add a little bit of extra information, expanding taxonomy data, for example, into a record while it's going into to an index. But then I have other interesting opportunities, like we see here that they have the tools added for semantics and text mining. And this is a very special kind of opportunity to inject some information about context that wasn't there before. So I might be able to expand the surface area of my data by augmenting it, by injecting terms from dictionaries, for example. But it doesn't guarantee contextual matches. But using tools and semantic technologies, we have some interesting opportunities to add data about the relationships of information or people to other information or other people. And this gives us a great place to try to build a kind of contextual experience that, that maybe wasn't there before. So, next version, this is a typical SharePoint stack model about SharePoint search. Similarly, I take in information in content processing, I add some additional information, and on the query side is where I do most of my context work inside of a SharePoint model. I tend to start here and say, from the query processing side, this is where I can grab data from my user profile, for example, and match this up with contents that I have inside of my, the contents that I have inside of these various content repositories. So the context here is more focusing on the user and less about what I can learn from the content. Some other interesting notes on that subject, though, would be that we have tools from Microsoft now, like the Office Graph, which are providing a very, very interesting kind of context. So we don't really describe it outside of the search core here, but we have these tools that provide data about the interactions between people. Is anybody on the line familiar with this sort of technology? You can feel free to, again, post a comment in the chat box if you're interested.
It looks like there's a few people, Dave, who have some questions. Yeah.
I don't see questions.
There are no written questions. I've tried to contact some of them. For example, Cyprian and George and Edward. If there's a question, you can feel free to write it in the chat window, and we can try to address it.
Yeah, we'll have some time, and we're also getting close to the end of the overall presentation here. So we'll get out of the concept in just a moment, and then if there's more than a few questions, I'm happy to address them. So in our core stack, we have this opportunity with things like the Office Graph to take relationships between documents and people. It's a different kind of context that doesn't usually exist in inside of content on its own. And this is why it's a graph index and not just a full text search index, for example. But it provides us with, again, a very unique kind of context, a way to connect our people to our information in a way that you don't usually think about it. And this is to say that we see things like, typically I am looking for something in my search portal, for example, or I'm looking for something inside of my document or somewhere else. If I'm not looking for keywords or this kind of specific specialized data, I'm usually looking for something else that's relationship oriented. Someone showed me something, or someone has shared a thing with me in the past, and now I'm wondering what happened to it or if I can find it again. And the Office Graph, because it's, again, a graph index of relationships, not of contents, this gives us an interesting view to say, show me only things that so-and-so has presented to me or have been presented in this context or that context. And with that, I'll give you kind of a teaser here to think about afterwards. So we've simplified the story a little bit about how we produce context and how simple it is to bring together context and people and information. And we talk about audiences a little bit and how an audience can be a way of segmenting your end consumers, people, into groups so that we can target content a little better. But we didn't really talk about how you might define them or the types of things that you might be looking at. So this is another model that I adapted from the Polar Bear book, and the thing to note is that your audiences are probably inside of kind of search cycles, which we break down as being a kind of research, exploration, perfection, and refinding. So when we're talking about research, usually we're thinking of a exhaustive search. Think about legal discovery as an example. When I'm looking for something, I want to see all possible data, everything, 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 everything. I don't know exactly what I'm looking for, but I know that I have to have considered everything. If I'm looking at an exploration scenario, then I have more of a curiosity. I'm used to calling this kind of an information discovery and not necessarily a legal discovery where I must have everything, but more curiosity. You're browsing, you want to get information on a theme or subject, a project. You don't have to see everything, but you want to see enough for you to build a better understanding or maybe to know that you should change your focus or to look for something more specific. Perfection in the model here is the example that I mentioned just a moment ago. You're looking for something specific, and if you don't find that specific thing, you'll probably be unhappy. You know, I know that Joe shared this document with me, or Joe showed me that presentation. It must be there somewhere. Where is it? And if I don't find that exact presentation, then I'm going to be disappointed. And it's important to note this because very frequently when we see a search solution being deployed as a standalone solution, for example, and not just as a part of an application, but if you're building a standalone search portal, most people build for exploration and try to hit perfection, but it's really hard to do perfection without having a very clear picture of exactly who is doing the searching and what they're usually looking for. So what we usually end up with is someone that builds a solution for research, tries to build for perfection and ends up somewhere in exploration, when in fact they're really four totally different types of contexts, and you should try to build a solution that addresses all four, so that when you're talking to an end user, when you're talking to people about how they're going to use the service, that you get a very specific thing. Usually, if we are working with perfection, we're talking about an app or some other kind of context where we want to do some searching. We want to match up a person with some very specific information. And we have a very clear idea of what kind of place we're going to get the data from. And we are very good at hitting the perfection model when we're looking in that space. But once it's broad, it's very broad, and it's hard to get out of the exploration mode without spending a lot of time and energy on this. So if you're looking for some homework, you might think about solutions where you're trying to match people to information today, and think about how they fit into this kind of model. Are they refinding? Are they looking for a specific thing? Are they browsing, or are they looking for exhaustive research? And if you're not sure, then there's an opportunity to improve. So that said, when we're talking about search in the IA space, there's some key points, some key takeaways. It's a little more complicated than it looks. There are definitely more stories than you probably expected to identify. I think we've already seen this, that there are many, many different contexts that you can try to match to many, many different audiences, and as a result, this probably means a lot more story building than people are used to. There's more tools than you'd be able to implement at any given time. I mentioned that there were many packages and search solutions available from some vendors that can augment other content systems, and you know, you can't use all of them, but there's or you use the right tool for the job, of course, but there's a lot of background noise. Okay, there's more tools than you'd be able to use, and of course that it's more fun than work. I really enjoy bringing people to the right information at the right time. It's something that you can clearly see has an impact on the way people work and on the way that, or on whether or not they're happy with the tools they're using. So it's very satisfying to make that work for someone. So if these are if you were looking for key takeaways, I would say more complicated than it looks, more stories than you were probably expecting, more tools than you can use, and more fun than work. So that's the presentation. Jen, did you say you're able to see some of the questions?
I think it's more of a comment than a question. Looks like from Rajiv. And so once more, it just says Microsoft Graph APIs, like people, etc., are very powerful and interesting development from Norwegian arm of Microsoft.
Yes, all accurate. Developed in Norway. This actually spun out of the Fast Search team. This was an acquisition Microsoft made roughly 9-ish years ago. I know the dates very well because I was working for Fast Search when it was acquired. And so this was my introduction to Microsoft some years back. I took a job at this little Norwegian software company, and maybe 3 or 4 months in, they announced that they were being acquired by Microsoft. So I spent my entire career at Fast and then Microsoft in this shadow here. And now I see audience question, no question, want to know if you can see this. Yes, I can see it too.
There was also a previous comment from the beginning of the presentation where it says Lucene would suffice most of the search requirements.
So interesting notes there, and that's true actually. A lot of the work, I kind of glazed over what is being used as the index. You know, that I'm again working for Microsoft most of the time. I'm talking to customers about using Microsoft-oriented search technologies. But the Fast Search customers, for example, were using all sorts of tools. And in that space, Lucene is also very big, Elasticsearch is very big, but at the core, they're all just matching engines. And they give you a lot of extensibility options, and a lot of the goal of the presentation here is to highlight that most of the work and most of the interesting part is not just in configuring an indexing service. It's actually in matching up the right context and getting people to the right information. And this is the part where you spend a lot of time working on, not on sharding an index, for example, for scalability, but on picking out the right things to add into your content, the right metadata for the right people. And that's the part that's not so easy. It's not that it's impossible, and most of the time you can get a lot of, we see a lot of bang for the buck, yeah? That there's a lot that can be done with very little effort. If you know that your end consumer is focused on a very specific thing and you're using the Lucene product, it's very simple to create a pipeline stage in this Tika toolkit, for example, that will inject some new data into content, even if it's semantic data, and to make this a part of your user experience. You know, if you know that people are looking for a certain type of data, and it's some sort of derivative of the content that you have, you can probably squeeze it into the index to make it a seamless part of the search experience. You might also federate it if you already have an index or you already have a way to surface the data in a meaningful and scalable way. But typically people are putting things together into one index so that they can retrieve it in one query, which is partly a technical solution. That is, that it's not really necessary to get all the data from one point, but the more federated sources that you add to a user experience, then the more asymmetry you will see in the loading, for example. So the slowest source loads last, this kind of thing, and users are not always happy with this kind of topic. Again, if the audience would like to hear more on these topics, just reach out and let me know, and I'll know that that's a good indicator that I can build more in-depth content on the, again, the nuts and bolts of how this maps back into your architectures in the future.
David, it's Daryl Carr, one of the co-organisers for the event. Just whilst you're answering those questions, I'm just going to pop up a quick poll for everybody to respond to, just to rate the session, if you don't mind.
Go right ahead.
Won't be a sec. Great, thank you. So for those listening online, you should see the poll appearing now. So by all means, if you can answer that question, and we'll get back to David and see if there's some more questions for him.
Okay, so
I'm still here.
Yeah, still there.
Anything?
That poll is up. Looks like we're at the end with Dave's presentation. Should there be any questions, now's the time. Yeah, I really appreciate you giving the presentation, Dave, today. Thanks for being a part of this event.
My pleasure. My pleasure. It's a theme that is close to my heart. And as I mentioned, anyone that wants to connect and talk more, I'm happy to. This is my field of expertise, and I am happy to share it.